Welcome to the Nerds and Friends podcast. In this very special episode, I am joined by Owen Conklin to talk about plants, education, and just science in general. Welcome to the podcast, Owen.
Thank you for having me, Josh. I'm excited.
Of course. Well, I'm really stoked because we met through TikTok, where I was talking about wanting to have more science and education-oriented guests on the podcast. So I'm really glad that we get to talk today. Can you kind of start by telling us your your specializations and your background in the sciences?
Sure can. So I am what I'd like to say a lot of people who go through college end up in the science sometimes, whereas I am what I'd like to consider a scientist, but also I don't use it as much now as I could. So
Okay.
when I was in high school, I had the idea of limitless direction, no idea where I want to go. But I ended up in classes that focused well with growing plants and greenhouse work, and it really, for a long time, spoke to me quite a bit. And I ended up tending plants there as a high schooler, growing things, selling things, and it led me to a college degree in nursery management and plant science. And
Wow.
I really enjoyed the atmosphere that I took away in college, that it still kept me in greenhouse space. Learned a lot more about mathematics to irrigation and to the growth cycle, all sorts of things you really should know in plant science. But plant science in general opened up my horizons. And when I went to college, I realized I really like people too. Like I spend a lot of time helping people and doing things. So after spending about 2 years in the industry side of things, I decided the economy tanked, and that also, leads to a lot of scientists in rare random directions.
Yep.
Economy tanked, and I decided I really wanted to get back into education. And first of all, started into the student development side, and now I work as an admissions and enrollment professional, trying to help students now find their path. And that, in many cases, leads folks to STEM opportunities across our region in New York State, as well as many other places.
That's awesome. That's so cool. That's a great story. I had a quick question. Just I have a couple questions based on everything you just told me. But does the life cycles and plant sciences and nursery management, does that kind of fall under botany, or is that a separate field of study?
So botany is part of it, and it really does depend. If you're going to go in terms of the science and analysis, botany is going to be your friend. The hardest part is many folks do not know if botany is really going to be the right fit for them until they get into some of the practice and science of it. I think that's where I watched my peers who were much more into the idea of plant science, genetics, and taking. One of the great things about plants is that there's a difference in the world of genetics from what you would experience with animals, because there's more of an acceptance of plants breeding for different characteristics and matching them up. It's not the same as you would with a fuzzy furry creature or a pretty lizard. But for plants, you can line up different genus and species a little bit. You want to get those species that are kind of correlated, but maybe have a little bit of difference, to see if you can cross and create some really unique types and things like that. That's really how the floral industry works, how the nursery industry works. So I saw my peers who were like really into science. They wanted to get down that because they would do the analysis and be able to create amazing things. Or let's say they really were into hydroponics, which were a lot of the other science-based folks in plant science would end up. They'd end up working with the natural water cycle and system with water and plants, which does still hit in the botany side. But beyond that, I had a lot of peers who ended up in the practical application side, who ended up nurseries or arboretums, teaching people about plants in a natural setting where you have collections and things. I had several friends end up in turf grass management. I have a lot of folks who they like to turn their passion for science and golf into an opportunity to go in that direction, taking
Makes
care of,
sense.
and there's a huge amount of chemistry and mathematics that takes place in that field to get greens at a professional level the way they should be. And that's, I think, right now we're in a weird space where plant science in general and botany or any horticulture-based programs are suffering a bit now. They're
Oh, really?
lower enrollment across the United States, and part of it is it's students are not necessarily aware of those tracks to go to plant science as much as they are. You have a lot of stories and a lot of TV shows about vet techs or veterinarians and things like that, zoologists. They're a lot prettier on camera as jobs in many cases than a botanist, or let's say a greenhouse worker, or things of that nature. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a disparity in that side of where folks are going in this side of the life sciences.
That I totally understand that because like the only botanist character I can think of is a character from The Expanse. Have you seen that show?
Yes, and that's a
Praxidinki Mang. He's a great character. I love him. And getting
I
into
I
the yeah.
I've seen them like the way that they approach I feel like is accurate because we had people come in when I was in college who did the science side but also people who were explorers, people who went
Oh,
in jungles across
that's
Asia and
cool.
South America trying to find new flora along their travels because you could, as long as you had the ability to identify what should naturally be taking place and then the difference in what you find,
Oh,
you could take them and that would lead you to everything from exploration with medicine to exploration with just looking at aesthetics for vegetation if it's a plant that is out there and like a commercial side of things.
interesting. And I like in certain parts of the world, is flora still like lots of opportunity for discovery of new species, kind of like on the ocean floor, we're still discovering tons of new marine wildlife. Is it kind of the same in certain parts of the world?
Less and less because again
Okay.
as humanity expands of course that's not as much but in
Yeah.
pockets in Asia and in Central and South America there were places that you could do that and find a diversity of plant life to be able to pull from but also plant life being what they are and what people are doing inside trying to crossbreed plants and things like that nature to let's say as an example the Alberta spruce is that dwarfed small blue spruce that you see sometimes in folks' lawns. That was the work of someone as a plant scientist to make sure that they could have the brighter blue that they are is from people
Oh,
bringing blue ones that have been been seeded or transplanted to be a bit brighter blue and bringing those together and trying to keep that life of the plant life and that trait moving forward in the genetics.
interesting. So like the blue hue was kind of a mutation, and then people like fixated on that and made sure it's propagated to where it became the norm for that species of plant, essentially.
Yes, and that's where
Wow.
aesthetics come into play a lot in plant science is people like pretty plants. That's, that's the basis
Right.
of where a lot of these things come from. And so if you really want that interesting color, you got to find a way to see if you can breed it to make it happen. And,
Mhm.
many times that just comes out of discovery of you discover and in the animal side, you discover you have a blue lobster. You want to maybe try to get more blue lobsters. That means breeding them with the dominant traits to get those. Same with plants.
Uh,
If you're looking for a unique marigold, let's say that is a really bright orange color and has some featheriness to the petals, you want to try to breed that with other marigolds who are in the same similar trait to try to move those genetic traits forward. And
that makes sense.
and there's a lot of genetic manipulation that can take place like at the seed level or at different places that does come with its own ethics and concerns much like
I was about to ask.
farm
Yeah.
agriculture is a great example where there's ethics to what that does to both the species or the environment in general.
Right.
And so there's a lot also in the chunkier parts of science ethics that you need to look at in these kinds of spaces as well.
Totally, totally. Well, like I was kind of thinking while you were describing all of that of like how I don't know much about like dog breeding either, but like there's a lot of talk recently about how, some dog breeds, like I think pugs are the one they're talking about where their breathing has been manipulated by the certain things, and they're kind of talking about the ethics around breeding that species still. So it's interesting that there's similar discussions around plants, and I figured there's like looking at their what do you call it, like their oxygen turnover rate or like the nutritional value if it's stuff that we're consuming. So,
The way that a lot of times it can become an issue is what we see with non-native plants. And actually, in my last
oh,
couple of years working in the field, but also what I do a lot of cases now with students, and I'll get into that in a bit, is talking about native plants because native species tend to do well not only for themselves but for the environment that they're in. So
oh,
a lot of what's taking place in now with ethical work in plant science is looking at your environment and working within it, not working outside of it. Because when you're bringing in outside species, there isn't a chance for it to become an invasive species. And invasive species is a huge area around botany as well as working with animal science now that is so important to keep in mind. And as globalization happens naturally in the way humans travel, things travel with us, and that has been the
Right.
history of how invasive species work all the time. Beyond that, nature is really good at teaching things how to live sometimes, and
Yeah.
that means through plants, the spreading of seeds, the unique ways that they get all over is really a marvel, but also a part of why things spread so much. So for me, I worked a couple years on the beaches in Massachusetts around Cape Cod. They focused a lot on the native plants there because it really also led to the structure for erosion, keeping erosion from beaches, keeping
Oh,
different dunes actually upright and protecting the Cape along that way. And the same can be said for many other areas of coastline, but it's also similar as you're rebuilding forests or building spaces or
wow.
among the plains, because that's what holds your soil structure in place, that will hold your water table in place. All those pieces have a contributing factor to that.
That's I I hadn't thought of how many ways it affects the terrain and the world we live in those ways. That's fascinating.
And these days, I again doing the I'm an admissions professional, so I don't get to talk about it in my everyday life in many cases. But I also am a leader amongst scouts in my area, and we talk a lot. We work a lot on the environment. That's scouting is still active out in the world, both in any way, shape, or form you may have experienced it. The idea is on our end is talking a lot about this connection to plants and animals and the environment because it has this is such when you talk about trying I talked a little bit about before not having people who are interested in going to this area of science. It takes exposure at a younger level across STEM, and that's any field, but especially STEM, that makes people feel confident that they can enter it and have an understanding, and maybe also work better in levels of high school work that prepare people well for college or research or working in the field later on. So
That makes
now
sense.
I like doing that with students who are scouts and teaching them to take care of the world, taking advantage of these native species, how to design things, how to grow things. And a lot of our scouts choose projects that work within the natural world, especially as they're doing service and growing as scouts older and on.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that makes sense that like kids should be exposed to all the different science fields out there so that as they're going through school and getting bombarded with tons of general education, they can kind of decide what interests them and what they want to specialize in. That's really good to have going into definitely high school and then beyond. So that's a really good point.
As a college professional, we also do a lot of connecting faculty with unique skill sets and unique areas of interest to students. We do that at a younger level the same kind of way because we serve students from across New York State, though we are very centrally located. We still get students from New York City in a very urban area, or say Buffalo. And by getting them exposed to areas of science in the outdoors, or even just like, let's say manufacturing technology and the way that computer systems are working, or chip manufacturing, our area of New York right now has become a hub for a research of sustainable battery production
Oh,
with green energy tech, as
that's
well
cool.
as yeah, we're also working in chip production. So there's a really big pull in our area for students who are going to be interested in STEM from an early age, so they know that they're going to go into a field that they can understand, but also that is important. And we have time, money, effort working towards that area in technology and science.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And forgive my ignorance on the process of like sustainable batteries, but do those use any plant-based chemicals or do some of the sustainable ones, or is it mostly mined material and like chemical reactions with certain metals?
I know there is some research taking place on what you can do with natural based chemistry. That's where I have to take the back seat to a different scientist because I feel there
For
is
anyone
the
listening,
time.
recommend us a future scientist to interview.
Yeah.
So,
That's the hard part about some of these things is part of what growing as a professional over time has taught me is being able to say I don't know and be confident. And it's okay to say you don't know,
yeah,
that lean on the expertise of others, because that's really those, but level of the creativity or the way you're thinking about it is the way that for sustainability purposes and for following like green energy, that's exactly the types of things you have to think about to see if that's possible, because those materials are better potentially in terms of their effect on the environment, their longevity potentially, or their easy and cost effective way to be able to put them together. I have a good example. When I was in college, I had a faculty member who was obsessed with the plant moringa. Moringa is a African-based shrub to tree style plant that was not native to this area, but as grown, it could provide. It had some medicinal applications for research, but also was a very cost-effective, water-effective growth crop for feeding certain types of animals in the farm culture. And again, very healthy as well for them. So he led his way to get research funding and be able to create it on a massive level to be able to create some plants, some more types of species that of some very types of moringa that are easier to grow in America. Now, and hopefully not causing exactly what I said, invasive plants and things like that nature. So
Yeah, I was gonna say there must be a fine line, kind of where you're mutating it to be, ideal for this environment and for the goal of feeding massive amounts of livestock and not having it become invasive or some unintended consequence, right?
that's exactly it. But that's he did it on the idea of how much it would affect the environment because again, less water and less need for nutrients. Like there's a lot going on for how what we use nitrate-based nutrients in the soil structure, what it does to plants over time. Whereas something like moringa, feeding it into the system of your crop rotation could do different things to provide nutrients back to the system, not leach them out of the soil. A lot of plants do that. That's why crop rotation is very important. It's always been a history of small scale agriculture. Large scale agriculture struggles with that at times.
Mhm.
And that's coming again. I live a weird life. I talked about again. I mentioned this in the things to use. I do all sorts of stuff. I content create on TikTok. I do this. I review board games and bakeries. My brother is an egg farmer.
Oh, okay.
So like we have a lot of varied background of how we see the world in a lot of unique ways.
That's awesome. Well, and I'm just thinking now, I mean, this study of plants, and especially with the large scale, there's so many things intertwined with it. The terrain, the water, the nutrition, how the nutrition is going to affect the animals that eat it, which, their meat products are going to go into humans potentially. Like, how do you deal with the data overwhelm and like kind of the so many interconnected data sets? Like, what are kind of some of the ways that you work through that?
So I have friends who are still in the field who tell me about what they see from, let's say, USDA as an
Yep.
example, that they see things that are researched domestically or then researched internationally and they don't line up. That is an issue with research across fields, is not being able to repeat a research study
Um,
and in the same conditions and things like that. And for data, if you're trying to, let's say, analyze, is this set of lettuce the one that caused the E. coli outbreak? Well, you need to be you can't
uh,
just kind of guess that. You need to be as on point as possible so that you're
yeah.
only like recalling plants, or let's say you're a part of agriculture and you're blocking a certain type of plants from coming into the United States or something like that. You have to be sure. So
Mm,
trying to rely on the best data, on empirical evidence the best you can, have knowing where you can go for research, and also making it so that research is taking place at the college level and
mm,
in many cases this is taking place at your research one institutions, your land grant colleges across the United States. It's why research funding for science is so important, and plant science is no different than other ones you'll find,
yeah.
because there is that if you don't have the data overload can just be done by, well, there's data from what we've done forever, because there's,
Yeah.
there's plant growers, farmers out there who have like, oh, I've been doing this for years. Here's my books. Here's my things you can see.
Kind of a tradition bias almost.
Absolutely. And that's the
Yeah.
problem, is that that can take place and really guide the viewpoints going ahead. That's even beyond talking about where governmental policy and lobbying and things can take you, that's the one thing that I have limited amount of patience for. So just kind
Yeah.
of, well, let's keep that on a separate note.
A bunch of non-scientists telling you how to approach the science. It's just ideal, right?
It's
Perfect
wonderful.
science.
I know very well that many of them are skilled in the science of human life and the human interaction and systems and sociology, and trying to put those pieces together. I think when you talk, that's where I feel data overload is, because we know that the side when you're putting the science of humans and sociology there has a lot of things that don't necessarily line up with some of the other pieces, which with environmental science and things of that nature. But we work on it every day.
That's amazing. Well, and like, I mean, the biggest thing that I think of is like agriculture and how that affects literally everyone. But yeah, wow, this is just blowing my mind. This is a great. See, I'm glad you're the first of our new science focus here on Nerds and Friends, and I'm loving it.
I wanted to say I like this. I got to listen to a few of the podcasts before, and one of the things I want to talk about with you is I am a big fan of nomenclature, and
Ah,
one of my nutty kind of things. And so I love your show because I feel it does hit the way I look at nomenclature, whereas nerds. Amongst them is where you're super into something and it is science based. It's usually STEM based. I
yeah.
do a lot, like my channel and what I talk about a lot is about geek life because I believe geek life, if you're really into something, necessarily science based. It can be fiction
Oh,
based and
okay.
fiction or other areas. Weeb is another one. We're very anime focused. I
Oh,
love
okay.
little bits of nomenclature around this because it kind of like we are all in this together, though those specific names do mean something, so it's okay.
Yeah, no, I like underneath nerds. You're right. There's a huge like I've actually been. I'll tell you about it here because I haven't done it anywhere. But I've always wanted to try stand up comedy as like just a bucket list thing. I don't think I could do it professionally, but I want to write a joke around saying like people make assumptions about what being a nerd means. When a non-nerd looks at me, they assume I can help them fix their projector and help them program their computer. And I could tell you all about the Star Wars universe. I can't help you with technology. I'm not that kind of nerd.
You
So
see that's where the geek side comes in because you probably
yes.
know what kind of computer you want to get potentially for a gaming rig or something, right?
Yes,
See
or
that
video
see
editing. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. See,
yeah,
that's the factor point. I feel like there's times though where you can find yourself being super into a science that means I tell folks this in the education field all the time. I don't use my plant science degree as much in what I do on a day-to-day living now. But what I do use is the critical thinking skills that I took away from that degree and working in that field and every single day. I also had the advantage because my program was built to be also business based. So I got a lot of business background outside of science, which
that's
to
awesome.
me, what I do in education, I cannot tell you how invaluable that is because the perspective of the way people see business and science together really does make a very different pragmatic approach to things. And so
Absolutely.
I like having that knowledge because I can look at some things that my peers have taken just from like a teaching or education background, but I had a background in contracts as well as in
Mm,
plant science. So I can look at it from those perspectives. And it comes to what having a well-rounded education, well-rounded liberal arts education is all about. For me, I high school me thought I was going to be in plants forever. If somebody had told high school me that I liked people as much and maybe that there wasn't as much money in what I thought there was in plants at the time, but there is now, and so I want to share with you in a minute.
ooh,
That there I probably would have ended up somewhere else than I did now. But the skills I took
mm,
away from that, I wouldn't like I they're invaluable every day.
that's
If
awesome.
if people are interested in plant science now, there are a lot of jobs out there to take advantage of. A lot of people ask me because I am their most likely person they know with a plant science degree. If it, of course, the conversation about cannabis comes up quite often, there is jobs out there in that because there's again a I hate to use the pun, but a budding industry in cannabis production that's happening.
Nice.
Uh, but beyond that, because I keep in touch with faculty, the other thing people are really super into is greens, microgreens, production of all sorts of lettuce and greens for, you know, not only for restaurants but for the mass market as well. And
Nice.
there's a huge market in how that works and how hydroponics works around that students who are very good at the science side of their plant science degree who want to go in the business field, there is a huge market of jobs for those folks and around almost every urban area. The one
That's awesome.
sad the one sad benefit of climate change is there's more growing season around this area of the United
Oh,
States. So it's a sad like silver lining, but
yeah.
it is out there. There is a lot of research that takes place still in plant science or in the business side, but also when it comes to climate change, because a lot of the preparation we have to do is how are plants reacting to the changes around the world, and are
Interesting.
there and a lot of people are thinking about how do I, much like there's home builders out there thinking about how do I set up homes to be more structurally sound with the new world that we're going to live in. There are people in plant science out there. How am I going to have trees that are more hardy to survive a tornado or heavy winds or microburst? How am I going to
Uh-huh.
have plants that are more drought tolerant because there might be some changes in the water table, the water structure, because there's that whole change of drought to all the rain ever is changing all around the country so often now. It
Wow. Yeah.
causes there's a massive issues with what happens in the world of plant life. And one of the hardest parts I have, again, knowledge in plant science is I don't use it every day, but I can look out at the what I see happening with plants. That's one of the easiest ways I can easily talk about folks about climate change is I can see the difference of what's happened in the cycle with plants in the seasons and the structure of it.
Oh wow. So it's already like noticeable to those who have an education of what to look for. That's fascinating but terrifying at the same
Both,
time.
yeah, I would
Yeah.
absolutely agree. At times, it was my parents are not are my I'm a first generation college student, so my parents do not have a background. My mom was a postal worker. My dad ran an auto parts store. I had a long conversation with them about the things I've noticed around, just like looking at the mountain sides around the hills around us, and it helped change their viewpoint on seeing like
Wow.
look at these things that you just can or can't do or you can't see anymore. We lived in an area of New York State that was regularly known for blizzards and heavy snow. We have gone years without heavy snowfall for a long time.
That's
And
terrifying.
so it is, but it goes to show what the world is changing. And by noting that and what that does to plants, you can note what that does to plants all the time by how plants are changing. When the color on our leaves change in the fall and how that time scale has changed so dramatically,
Wow.
you can really apply a lot of what you see in plants to how you see the world because they're an active part of it. They're an active, they in many cases react on a quicker basis to certain stressors than other things will to show you stuff.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, and I love that too, where you can illustrate with tangible evidence kind of something that is happening and take away the politics and talking points and just be like, let's look at the data sets around us. Like that's, but yeah, I mean, plants are like probably more biomass on the earth is plant life than animal life. So that,
I I
or maybe
believe
they're
there's a
tied.
if you're looking and you consider algae within this theme, algae usually is the tiebreaker, I believe, in this type of conversation.
And is
Because
algae technically a fungi, or is that why
well,
there's a differentiation? Or
algae, a lot of times people are looking at this by things that render photosynthesis.
okay,
So, so algae, with that in mind, kind of fits into that because they're producing oxygen back in the atmosphere.
yeah,
Even that now is strange because as the climate has changed, algae blooms, because there's a higher level of temperature out there, are more massive and create
oh,
more chemistry in the water table that can be super dangerous for the other life taking place in that water.
oh,
We have it around
wow,
us many cases where there's toxic water bloom, like toxic algae blooms that lowers the oxygen in the water, and
oh,
or also other things are happening chemically in the water that shifts that what's happening in the ecosystem. And
interesting.
there are a lot of great programs out there that review this, that look at this stuff. So for folks who are younger or thinking that well, is there a place for me to go in this area of the science field? There absolutely is. There's a lot of places that you can gain ground for jobs, for research, for all sorts of experiences and exposure.
Wow. That is encouraging, and that's awesome that there's so much opportunity to study this because it's these big changes we all think about, but not the little small effects they have that can be so massive. And wow, I'm learning a lot, man. This is awesome. This is
Very
great.
good.
What is trying to think of a good question. You've given me so much awesome information. What are some of the since climate change is overall a bummer with some very fascinating silver linings, what are like some exciting things that are kind of on the cutting edge of plant science that are being discussed, like possible things on the horizon that are cool and interesting?
So this is hard because I don't get to read as many of the fun cutting edge science pieces as I know my peers do. I
Yeah.
I do know a couple things. First off, and this is a kind of a long-term like type of story. The hardest thing to get in terms of plant color is blue. Blue is not an
Interesting.
easily naturally
Huh.
occurring type of pigment or hue within the plant structure. So things you get closer to a lighter blue color, like let's say hydrangea as a good example. The thing that is so well known for its blue because there isn't so many things that line up to it. And so that's
Interesting.
been everybody's like magic thing that they look for is trying to, and you'll note it as time goes on, there has been an increase on plants that you can get into that blue color hue. And that's come
Uh,
over long periods of time of what we were talking about before, breeding plants selectively in order to try to generate that type of hue and color.
Interesting.
Another one I know is that there's a lot of talk about bringing back trees that have had major issues with invasive insect die off or things of that nature. Because elms are a great example. The At a certain point, I believe before I was born, I don't necessarily know, and I'm going to turn 40 this year, so I don't want to look. I know that the elm tree was so blighted by insect pestilence that they basically, in order to try to mitigate, they took them down all over the United States and decimated the population of the trees. Now, at the emerald ash borer, still is around and still causing problems. But what they've done is they have developed hardier, more resistant styles of those trees in order to try to have them be able to survive alongside this insect and be able to repopulate that. And you'll see that with
That's
other
great.
other plant species and things that get super affected by this type of invasive species or things. There's a lot of efforts out there to how do you get them more space back in the ecosystem, regrow them, getting out the invasive species. It is super hard because invasive species is like a whack-a-mole. As soon as you
Yeah.
take some out, they could be virulent enough that they come right back, or they just could, or be replaced by something separate.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, part of the important things that we can do, and even I can do, and I do this on a pretty regular basis, is about awareness. Invasive species awareness is a huge thing. Sharing what's out there so others know. As an example, I have a fiance who is not a plants person. She has a music degree and is amazing as a music teacher. She and I talked about wildflowers and things, and I was pointing out that she loves some wildflowers. That one's invasive. That one's probably a bad idea. Let's not, we don't want to keep growing that one. Things
Yeah.
like that come up. And if you provide awareness and why things are like that, people kind of jump on board and
That's awesome.
understand it. We have a huge issue in our area of New York because there is a plant, invasive giant hogweed, which I don't know if
Oh,
you ever heard of. It
I
is
have
it
not.
is it is a relation to the parsnip. That parsnips, again, really, carrots and things, natural carrots occur in the wild. This is something that grows as large as 6 to 8 feet tall,
Whoa.
but its evolutionary path took it down that if you break its stalks, leaves, things like that, it has developed a corrosive enough and structure and chemistry inside. It will burn you. It will blind you. It
It's
is
a xenomorph.
huge.
My
It,
goodness.
it is real bad. It is something that now the
Wait, like,
DEC
so if a
department,
person breaks it, like, it can blind you? It's that
yeah,
powerful?
it is that
Whoa.
bad. And there are plants like that. There have always been plants like that for a long time, but this is something that's
I didn't know
definitely
that.
new, invasive, on the rise. And so DEC in New York State has been very adamant about getting it out there. Like, if you see this, don't go with your garden gloves and try to pull it. Make sure that there's a lot of effort if you have the knowledge or science in terms of action around the area to make sure that you mitigate potential disasters that could take place with things like that. I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of the knowledge in science needs to go to is applicable in many cases, because that also
Yeah.
gets people in the space where they maybe feel like they could enter the field and gain more knowledge too.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think practicality and applicability, which I think are both words, are very important to people's interests, especially when they're younger. I mean, I remember in school I enjoyed like algebra and geometry, but there were so many of my fellow students who were like, "We're never going to use this," and they got really disheartened about it. But like, there are some of the aspects that I use now as an adult just for business planning and stuff. So that's really
I
cool.
I have a 13 and 50-year-old where we've had to have that conversation at this point.
Yeah.
Yes, you will use this, not the way probably you're thinking, nor your teacher, but that's fine.
Yes. It's still good to learn it, and like you said, that critical thinking is huge.
Mhm.
Well, I write fantasy novels, and in my future books, there's going to be some characters getting attacked by plants that can blind them and have corrosive insides when they get broken. So I appreciate that. That's
Very,
awesome.
very, you can definitely take it. I am a live player for D&D, and so
Nice.
like much like you
Same
said
here.
with character work, I tend to find that picking up somebody like this or picking up some fun aspects around this is always great. We're playing a game of Planet Escape right now where I'm playing a gelatinous style creature,
Huh.
basically, and so that it's just kind of fun because my body doesn't move like anybody else's. But we made it a point because of some of the things I've talked about that in the space in where we're talking about, mint has gone extinct, and so my character has this little side quest of figuring out, trying to find mint somewhere. In this D&D area, like that we're just playing out and having fun. And the DM, made it a lot of fun. They made some really cool little story bits around it. It's things like that that you can incorporate. You said it yourself. You don't know like many botany characters. They're not somebody who really stands out in many cases, but there is some really cool things you can do with it if you know to know.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great side quest trying to find like how can we resurrect mint, the
And
extinct delight of the world. That's so
there's
cool.
one of the things that's on my list right now. I end up making way too many to-do lists of really cool ideas. I am planning to write a class of druid that doesn't wild shape into plant, or wasn't wild shape into animals, but I want them to wild shape into plants.
I
And
would love that. That would be
yeah,
so cool to have.
it's on my. I have the outlines of it. It's one of those like you really need to write actual, stat blocks and things like that, right? I'm like, yeah, I need to do that.
That will I run a lot of games. I'm a professional DM as one of my side gigs. So I'd love to play test that if you once you get some down. I'd love to try it with my players and get you feedback. That'd be really cool.
I'd be up for that. I love playing TTRPGs. I think they lend well into a lot of folks. Fantasy always can lend itself well with science. I'm an
Yeah.
artificer stan, just as a random aside,
Nice.
because it's
Same
very
here.
science. It is science based. You can do a
Yes.
lot of cool things with that. But to me, that's you can pair a lot of these things together. There's a lot of systems that lend themselves well to work in science. It's another great place for exposure for those who are younger. There's a lot of I love where we are now because there's so many ways to get more exposure to STEM than I remember as a kid.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways that you can connect. Again, I have young kids who have grown up in an area where they have had access to technology their entire lives, but also we've been able to take them to things where they can see science in action, whether or not, museums have created active exhibits and interactives.
Yeah.
Libraries, in many cases, create a lot of unique experiences. There's maker spaces out there in the world. So like, there's just so many ways that you can just provide those doors to get like just feel like it's accessible.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I haven't been to too many museums recently, but when I have, there's so much more interactive than when I was a kid, you know? So much
Mhm.
more like immersive and I love it. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, Owen, this has been an amazing interview. Thank you so much for a great episode of Nerds and Friends. Before we go, I have one final question. To anyone wanting to get into STEM, whether they're young or old, like what's the one piece of advice you would give someone who wants to kind of pivot wherever they're at in life and move their focus into any of the sciences?
Great question. I will start with two ages because realistically, the hardest part is figuring out this question is different for folks depending on where they are. If you have a kid who is super into science, just take and show them stuff. The other, you can see, we talked about museums, there's a lot of things at libraries. Also, there's a lot of people like us out there who really want to show off their super nerdy science thing that
Yes.
some kid somewhere is really going to get into. You can find us. We're not that hard to find in many cases.
Yes.
So you got kids to do it that way. If you're an adult though, let's say you're getting out of high school or beyond, then one of the best places to go is with your education. And I'm a community college person. I'm an advocate as a community college director that if you want to find something that high impact at a low cost, and you're in the United States, sorry, international folks,
Right.
you see what's out there at your local community college to get started with. Because even if you're just auditing a class, it really can set you up for so many paths of success in low or high levels of impact, really just depending on what you want to do. Because
That's
those
awesome.
doors are meant to be open and accessible for its local community to grow and build. And that's what a community college is after and what they should be there to help you with.
That's awesome. Well, that is a great end note. Thank you so much, Owen Conklin, for a delightful and educational Nerds and Friends episode. This was awesome.
Thank you for having me. It was a great time.
Yeah, for sure.